As we prepare to partake of the Lord's Supper, I would like to examine the patience of Christ. From my own experience, I see that there are different kinds of patience, as far as I can tell. I mean, there's a lot of ways you could describe it, but there's short-term patience, like getting through a struggle that happens within an hour or two, or perhaps a day. And then there's long-term patience, the kind of patience that can take months or years or decades. As far as I can tell, both of these kinds of patience are extremely valuable and worth the thought and effort and self-awareness required to obtain them. It's no surprise that it's easy to see patience in Jesus, especially considering that it's a fruit of the Spirit. When you really think about it, you can see the patience of Jesus in his submission, in how he endured in meekness, and how he waited in faith, in his contentment and his composure, and in his self-control, and in how he suffered, of course. And whenever we read the accounts of Jesus, we behold this calm, quiet, restful patience. Throughout his life, we can see humility, his submission under God, how he waited on God, a general absence of haste, if you will, a perfect calmness of soul, and every characteristic of perfect patience. We see his patience in difficulty. For instance, when he was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, he fasted for 40 days, was hungry, and tempted by the devil, yet did not sin and did not give in to the temptations of the devil. We see his patience with those who would have the heart to follow him, for those who have faith in him. In his daily walk here on earth, day after day, you see the healing, the cleansing, the casting out of demons, the bringing back to life those who had died, and not to mention his patience as a teacher. I specifically think in regards to his patience as a teacher, one instance comes to mind. In Matthew chapter 14, in verse 13, we read about how Jesus, feeds 4,000 people, multiplies the bread and the fish. But then again, a chapter later in Matthew 15, we're in a similar situation, and his disciples are like, well, what are we going to do, Jesus? There's all these people. It's like, well, wait. And it's easy for us to look at that and to be surprised that the disciples are kind of slow to catch on with that. But then if we look in at ourselves, how many times has God shown that he's going to take care of us, and yet, I'm worried about this, or that, we doubt that he will take care of us, don't we, from time to time? But yet, with those instances, with the feeding of the masses, when the disciples don't seem to remember, Jesus repeats the feeding we don't read an account of him showing frustration, that his closest followers have forgotten what he was capable of. And furthermore, we know, or we can assume, we know that Jesus knew what they would someday do as he patiently trained them and built them up. I suppose one of the greatest of all of examples of Jesus' patience we probably see in his suffering. He endured the cross, and in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 23, we read, when he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. And in Isaiah 53, he is illustrated so accurately in the prophecy. We read, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before his shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. Throughout all the buffetings, the shame, the dishonors, the griefs, the pains and sorrows he patiently endured. the sham of a trial, the spitting in his face, the beatings, the slaps, the mocking, the denial of Peter, the betrayal of Judas, the crown of thorns shoved into his head, and the long, painful crucifixion. He patiently endured it all until his final words, "It is finished," and until he had completed what God had sent him to do. We sometimes sing a song, and we sing, "He could have called 10,000 angels to take care of those Romans, the Romans and the Pharisees, those against him." But he didn't. He was willing to endure with patience the task that God had given him. And into his patience, our hearts are to be directed. We who belong to him are called to be like him, to follow in his footsteps, full of love and patience. His humility, submissiveness, contentment, calmness, steadfast endurance, in doing and suffering the will of God must be reproduced in our lives. Yet to talk the talk is easy enough, but to walk the walk is quite a challenge, as many of us probably know, especially if you're parents. Test your patience right there, yes? You have to wait quite a while for many things to be learned. I read an interesting passage from 1910. 1910, I don't know this man, but I liked his words. Arno Gaebelein. He wrote this in 1910. "How great the haste and hurry of present-day life! How little quietness and contentment! In suffering and in loss, we hear murmurings, fault-findings, and words of forced resignation, far more frequently than joyful songs of praise. Unrest instead of rest, discontent instead of contentment, anxiety instead of simple trust, self-exaltation instead of humility, ambitiousness instead of lowliness of mind are found on all sides." And it was just interesting to read that and to think about the challenge that is set before us. Well, and that was in 1910, but it's very much the same today, over 100 years later. And so I challenge you as I challenge myself. Don't let the world rob you of your patience. Don't give up in your attempts to follow in the footsteps of Jesus. We are, after all, patiently waiting on the return of Christ, and we must be prepared for that day. In 2 Peter chapter 3, starting in verse 8, we read this following passage, 2 Peter 3, verse 8. "But do not overlook this one fact, beloved, that with the Lord, one day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day. The Lord is not slow to fulfill his promise, as some count slowness, but is patient toward you, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief, and then the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved, and the earth and the works that are done on it will be exposed. Since all these things are thus to be dissolved, what sort of people ought you to be in lives of holiness and godliness, waiting and hastening for the coming day of God, because of which the heavens will be set on fire and dissolved, and the heavenly bodies will melt as they burn. But according to his promise, we are waiting for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells." Praise be to Jesus Christ for his sacrifice and for the hope of heaven that we have because of the forgiveness that is offered through his shed blood. Let us now partake.